So I have to forewarn you all, today's presentation has a lot of information and we don't have a lot of time. So I always like to say to buckle your seatbelts because it'll be a fast ride today. So as those who joined us yesterday, we are in a 4-part series of mental health entitled Come and Go. Now, I won't review the entire presentation from yesterday, but just a few points before we go into our presentation for today. So it was entitled yesterday, Come Understanding the Problem. So we looked at these texts, specifically the first one in Luke chapter 18, and we see there the command to come follow me. And we asked this question, what is a prerequisite to follow Jesus? And in that very verse, we see that what comes before follow is to come, right? We often forget that the simplicity of just coming to Jesus, as well as it's highlighted there, recognizing that we lack something. That's why we are coming. So a prerequisite to following Jesus is coming because we recognize our need of him. So we talked about the mental health crisis that we're currently in globally, but also trying to think about it from the perspective of how do we struggle individually, right? It's easy to think about the world and their struggles as a way of not looking in the mirror and seeing our own struggles. But as we do, that is what encourages us to come to Jesus. Now today, right, we want to continue on that journey of learning how to come and follow Jesus. The next step, right, we could ask in coming and following Jesus would be, we see in the text again, after recognizing our need, we see here that it says to sell all that you have and distribute to the poor. Now, we read these texts in a spiritual context, but what does this mean practically from a mental health perspective? We can also see in Matthew 16 that we have come, we have follow, but what do we see there in the middle? It says, let him deny himself and take up his cross. What does that mean? If we were to summarize that into one word, that would be talking about surrender, right? Surrendering the things that get in the way of coming and following Jesus. Many times as Christians, we say, yes, I want to come and follow Jesus, but we don't recognize the things that are getting in the way. And so today we're going to focus on surrendering those things that get in the way of following him. Now, what do we need to surrender? Any thoughts? What do we need to surrender? Ourselves, yes. And oftentimes we say our hearts, right? Because that includes ourselves. But what does that mean, our hearts? Right? It's not just this organ in our body. What we're talking about, essentially, our minds. So surrendering our minds. We need to surrender our minds when we come and follow Jesus. Now, we're going to take a look at our minds from a threefold perspective: behaviors, emotions, and thoughts. And this is specifically, some of you may be familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy. By a show of hands, who here is familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy? All right, a good number of you. Some of you not so familiar. But we're going to take this approach, and I'll explain a little bit more of what is cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT is one of the leading and most effective treatments worldwide for psychological concerns. And whether it's depression, anxiety, insomnia, OCD, fill in the blank, it is recognized as the most evidence-based, researched treatment. And we'll talk about in a little bit that it comes from the Bible, but I want to give you some practical examples to see how effective and important this treatment is. So here's an example that I'll walk you through. Same situation, but two different individuals, okay? So we have here David and Jack, and they both received poor grades on a test, okay? Now Jack, he responds in one way, and David in another. So let's look at Jack here. So we first focus on the thought. He has the thought, oh, I'm so stupid. If I was smart like Michael, I would have passed, right? Is that a negative or positive thought? Negative, right? And now we would see the impact of our thought on our emotion. Do you think he's happy? No. So our thoughts impact our emotions. So he's feeling depressed. And then our emotions will impact our behaviors. So Jack, because he had this negative thought that resulted in unpleasant emotion, will then have a behavior such as this. He decides to give up on studying. Why? Because he's thinking, well, if I'm so stupid, why try anyways? So he stops studying, and what happens? He starts getting worse and worse grades, and then he thinks, look, see, I am stupid. He confirmed his own belief. So our thoughts impact our emotions, which then impact our behaviors. Now, David has a different response. David, realistically, not just positive thinking, he's like, wow, I definitely underestimated that test. I should have studied harder. Now, he doesn't have this happy emotion. He has some disappointment, but also confidence that he can do better next time. And you'd expect a different behavior. Then he decides to study. Do you see how there's two individuals, same situation, but different responses? There's a choice in how they respond. And we see here the connection between our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors. A lot of times we just focus on the behaviors, do better, do better. Well, in order to change our behaviors, our thoughts, emotions, we need to change one to affect the other. So here, I want to emphasize, what is the goal of CBT? The goal of CBT is to teach us that while we cannot control every aspect of our lives and the world around us, what can we control? How we interpret and deal with what happens in our environment. This is so vital into what we talked about yesterday. In a great controversy, a battle that's happening day in, day out, we have a lot of things that are not in our control. But a lot of times we see that and we think, okay, I'm just here, right? But we do have control in how we respond. And this especially is encouraging to us in our walk with Jesus. I can learn to change my thoughts, my emotions, and my behaviors. And essentially what this is highlighting is choice. That although we live in a broken world, we still have choice. One of a favorite book of mine called Man's Search for Meaning, it's about a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps. And in this book, he emphasizes the power of choice. He talks about, he was looking around and he saw that there were still good individuals, people who'd give up their last piece of bread, people who were being kind and generous, comforting others. And he goes on to say, he says, they may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing. We're all cued in. What's that one thing, right? The last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. It goes on to say, and there were always choices to make every day, every hour, offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threaten to rob you of your very self. There are many things happening in our day-to-day that are trying to rob us of the opportunity to choose our own way. It says to choose your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of the typical inmate. Every single day, in such a tragic situation, there were still individuals that had choice. They were stripped of everything, and yet they chose to have those decisions that could make them not a plaything of circumstance, but that they could stand apart from the others. So here we see in the Bible from Ephesians 4, this interaction between our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors. The Bible is full of CBT principles. It talks about you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, talking about behaviors, putting away, that's what we're going to focus on today, which is being corrupt by its deceitful desires, emotions, and then to be made new in the attitude of your minds. And so again, today we're going to be specifically focusing on behaviors, surrendering our behaviors in order to follow Jesus. So today's talk is entitled Follow, Addressing Behaviors. Tomorrow we'll be talking about follow, but from the perspective of surrendering our thoughts and our emotions. So let's talk about behaviors. Now, many times when we talk about behaviors, we think it's the outcome of our thoughts and our emotions, right? So, I need to change my thoughts and emotions first. Actually, our behaviors can also impact our thoughts and our emotions. This is the whole idea behind pharmaceuticals, right? They know that we have different brain chemicals. Now, a lot of times, they boil it down to just brain chemicals and say, okay, you have a deficiency in serotonin, then you need this serotonin helper through medication. But what research shows is that our choices also impact our brain chemicals. Isn't that powerful? That there are things that I can do that help in my brain chemistry, which is odd to us. We think that it's something I need to take internally, but something I do externally can help with my brain neurotransmitters. So we're going to talk about what are the behaviors I can do that can impact my brain chemistry. So here's a very simplified version of different brain chemicals. You see here that with schizophrenia, it has too much dopamine, right? So with mental illness, there could be too much of something, too little of something. We notice with anxiety, you have too little of dopamine. Also with fight or flight, you have too much of norepinephrine and epinephrine. So there are different chemical imbalances. With depression, you have low serotonin and low dopamine. And then you notice there with happiness, right, you have a lot of serotonin. It's the happy hormone or mood hormone. And then with love, you have a perfect balance of dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone that we get when we hug, we touch, and we have connection. So what we want to do is we want to have a balance in our chemicals. So what are some of those behaviors? We're going to walk through a couple of steps of what we can do to improve our minds through behaviors. So the first step is to know what and why we need to surrender. So even before we just start making some changes, we have to really understand what we're surrendering and why we need to surrender them. So let's start off with this question of what are common behaviors that negatively impact our minds? Any ideas? And of course, these also get in the way of following Jesus. What are some negative behaviors, unhealthy behaviors? Selfishness, okay. Alcohol. Recreational drugs. Procrastination, yes. Overeating, Facebook, yeah. So I'll name a few. This is not a comprehensive list. Substance use is a very common one. Gambling and other behavior addictions. Pornography, TV entertainment. This also includes video games, social media, poor sleep, poor diet, refined sugar, chronic stress, and caffeine. So I wanted to include a variety there. Some you might be able to say, I don't have substance use problems, but then I might struggle with poor sleep or other ones. So a lot of different behaviors can impact our mind. Now the question is, why do I need to surrender these things? And I want to really spend a little bit of time with this because not just for ourselves to understand why, because it helps us with longer term success if we're anchored with a reason, but also when we educate younger generations. A lot of times we say no, instead of helping them understand that God has a reason behind his restrictions. There are things for our benefit, and so we need to understand why. So let's take a look at why we need to surrender these things. First off, we have to understand and recognize that sin is pleasurable, okay? So we'll take a look at that. Following Jesus and denying ourselves can be hard. So oftentimes we just do the flip. We say, sin is bad. Following Jesus is easy. And then a teenager or someone vulnerable is introduced to sin and it's pleasurable. And then, what? Or maybe they start their walk with Jesus and it can be hard. So we have to understand that sin can be pleasurable, following Jesus can be hard. So the question becomes, why follow Jesus? So let's take a look at this. Sin is pleasurable. Proverbs 9:17 says, stolen water is sweet, food eaten in secret is delicious. This is acknowledging that sin can be pleasurable. Now, what happens in our brain? This is really important to understand. So here on the top left is a normal curve of what happens in our brain when we do something pleasurable and we get dopamine. Dopamine is a reward, motivation, pleasure hormone. But to the right, what we see is when we engage in some sort of unhealthy, let's say, addictive behavior. So we can use, let's say, sugar for an example, because that's a little bit more relatable to us. So what happens in our brain is when we eat refined sugar, we get a nice, high hit of dopamine. We feel good, right? So sin can be pleasurable, but what happens afterwards? So if this is baseline, it goes and it's a high hit, we feel great, and then it starts to crash. And what happens is it doesn't just go back to baseline, it actually drops below baseline. So what happens is I want more sugar. I want to get back to that high pleasure. So I go and I have some more sugar. This is very similar to, let's say, someone who's taking drugs. They have this high hit, and people who struggle with addiction, they call it chasing the ghost or chasing the dragon, because they had this initial high and it's very pleasurable, and they're trying to feel that again. Just to pause for a second, we need to really sympathize and empathize with people who struggle with these things, because it does feel good. They're going to this for pleasure. They have a hole in their heart that they're seeking to be filled. And then it dips. And you notice the graph on the bottom. What happens over time is you're seeking it more and more. And what actually happens is that you get worse and worse. This is what Satan does. We know it kind of spiritually, but what happens in our brain chemicals is that he traps us with initial pleasure. It feels really great. And then we want to go back. And what happens over time is we build tolerance. That's why people have to have higher and higher amounts of drugs. This is why people struggle with caffeine. This is why people struggle with sugar, because you need more and more amounts to feel pleasurable. But you notice over time, you get worse and worse. Proverbs 14 says, there's a way that seems right? There's pleasure there to a man, but what's the end? Destruction. Destruction. So looking at these behaviors, I want us to think about, what do they have in common, right? We talked about how they're negative and unhealthy, but specifically, what's important to note is that they attack the frontal lobe. This is really important to understand. Satan is not just about, try this thing here and there and seeing what works. He specifically has a mission to attack the frontal lobe. So let's go through some examples. Here is a brain scan of a 28-year-old, a young individual who uses marijuana. Now, look at this. It's important to note it's only weekend use. So this is not like, this person's using massive and massive amounts, but we see the impact of even just weekend use. So this was done in 2014. What you see is the brain has atrophied. The brain is shrinking in volume, in shape, in density, especially in the gray matter, which is responsible for decision making. Our brain is shrinking, right? So marijuana use here. Now, alcohol use, this is also a young individual, 38 years old, 17 years of, again, weekend use, which has been fascinating to see in the research. Is when I was starting my studies in psychology, they used to say moderate uses of alcohol is healthy. Did you hear that before? As it continues, research continues, they have now been more definitive to say not even a little bit of alcohol is useful, which is so wonderful to see how God's truth, including in the spirit of prophecy, continue throughout time. They don't change. And research starts to catch up. But we see here with just a little bit of use, and you see especially in the frontal lobe area. Now, we can't cover all the different drugs, but here is a picture of individuals who have had meth use, who have alcohol use, nicotine, and so forth. And you see that there's a lot of damage to the brain, especially in the frontal lobe area. Now, what's important to note, we think, okay, these are substances, right? You're taking something that's harmful. But look at this scan here. This scan 1 on the left side is a healthy brain. In the middle is heroin use. And then on the right side is porn use. Which one is worse, heroin or porn? Porn! Isn't that surprising? Something that we're doing, not taking, is actually negatively impacting our brain to a larger degree than something that's taken internally. Our choices matter. Now, of course, heroin impacts the brain in different areas, so you can't fully say it's worse. It's worse in different ways. But we see that even something that we choose to do externally can really impact our brain. And you notice, especially the frontal lobe areas. Sugar also blunts dopamine release, and you can see that they compare it to cocaine use as well, can be as addictive also as cocaine use. And so things that we're choosing to do, and we all have our different struggles, can really impact our brain. So Satan's agenda in all of this, we can understand more by looking at the frontal lobe's function. What's the function of the frontal lobe? I know many of you are educated in that area. Decisions, yes, that's a key part. What else? Reasoning, yes. What else? Planning, yes. So here are a couple. It's the control center of the brain, manages attention, decision-making, planning behavior, which is also important in inhibiting behavior, right? So I used to work in a rehab center, and we could always tell the individuals who had frontal lobe injuries because they were doing very inappropriate behaviors because they didn't have the frontal lobe to say, hey, stop, slow down. You notice this when if someone is drunk, right, they don't make good decisions, or even the later and later you stay up at night, what happens to your decision-making capabilities? That's why Spirit of Prophecy recommends young people to not be staying on the phone really late because you might share more and more, right? Inhibition as well. One thing that people often don't realize, and it's really key to the frontal lobe, is the frontal lobe is responsible for controlling emotions. So I like to think about it, it's the brakes to your emotions. So would you feel comfortable driving a very, very fast car without brakes? No. Imagine when you're struggling with your emotions and your frontal lobe is weakened. So it's also important to regulating, controlling your emotions, self-awareness, personality, so forth. But specifically, it's recognized to be the seed of judgment, reasoning, intellect, the will, moral decision-making. It's where we connect with God. So it's not just about attacking our frontal lobe because of decision-making. He's especially interested in attacking the part of the brain that is responsible for choosing God, for connecting with God. Do you see how understanding the why we surrender these things becomes more important? It's not just something I do. It's not just a habit. It becomes an eternal matter. It's also referred to as the crown of the brain, which makes me think about crown of the brain when we talk about in 1 Corinthians 6 that our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Then we can think about our frontal lobe as if it's the most holy place. So we are allowing for our most holy place to be desecrated by these different behaviors. We can see also the connection with the mark of the beast, right? How could we be more vulnerable spiritually is also by these behaviors, right? Which we know will be on the forehead. So essentially, Satan wants to control our minds through the behaviors that we're choosing. So sin is pleasurable, right? But it's deadly. I like to think about Satan's agenda is easy now, hard later. So let's take a look at following Jesus and denying ourselves. Jesus was very clear, and there's multiple references to this, but we see in Matthew 8, another reference to follow me. There's somebody here that's very eager. He's like, oh, I want to follow you wherever you go. And Jesus is like, whoa, 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 let me kind of tell you how it is, right? He's like, holes and foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's going to be hard. And he goes on further to say, let the dead bury their dead. And what Jesus is describing here is he is being open to say it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. When we look at God's agenda and we look at these behaviors, many of these are not easy. Self-discipline, is that easy? Not at all. Spiritual growth at times cannot be easy. Service, right? Selflessness. Rest, connection, nutrition, establishing good habits can be difficult. I love this quote. It says, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Is when we understand the why, when we recognize that, yes, following Jesus is difficult at times, but it's life-giving, right? Jesus is like, okay, it may be hard now, but easier later. When we understand the bigger picture, then that's how we start understanding the answer to why to follow Jesus. I love this quote by Abraham Lincoln. Discipline is choosing between what you want now and what you want most. We have to recognize in surrendering these behaviors the truth that some of these are pleasurable now, deadly later. And we have to recognize that following Jesus is not always easy, but it's life-giving. What do I want now, instant gratification, versus what do I want most? So we can think about Satan's agenda appears like freedom, but he takes away choice and control, and the result is death. But God's agenda appears restrictive, but he gives us choice, and the result is life. So ultimately, as we start choosing whether or not to surrender and whether or not we even want to follow Jesus, we have to realize that there's a choice. There's a fork in the road. Satan versus Jesus, control versus freedom, death versus life. And when we think about mental health, mental illness versus mental health. So that's the first step. But what's step number 2? So step number 1, know what and why you need to surrender. So for you practically, what that looks like is as you're taking notes, think about specifically for me, what are the things that I need to surrender? It's so easy as human beings to see a list of those things and say, I don't have that problem. But it might be something like, I'm really struggling with my diet. I'm really struggling with my sleep. And then step number 2 is start to eliminate or reduce those unhealthy behaviors. So we're going to walk through that step now, step number 2. So how do I start eliminating or reducing unhealthy behaviors? So one of the biblical concepts that we see is flee, don't feed. I love this quote by Ellen White. She says, the first time the temptation comes, meet it in such a decided manner that it will never be repeated. We have to be very committed. Some of us will say, oh, I know I need to get rid of that, but maybe Monday, right? Or maybe after camp meeting, or maybe when, New Year's comes. That's a great way, right? Great time to start New Year's resolutions. We have to have a commitment in fleeing, not feeding. We see this also in James chapter 1. We have to recognize that temptation is different from sin, but specifically it says when desire has conceived, oftentimes we feed it, and then temptation conceived, then gives birth to sin. Now, some of you may be struggling with temptation and be really hard on yourself about that. Temptation will always be a part of life in this world as Satan is, loose. But we have to decide whether or not to meet that temptation with that commitment to say, God, help me to fight this temptation and not to conceive it, including not flirting with it. Okay. The next one is we have to hate it. Matthew 5 gives us a really good principle, and I love looking at these spiritual things that we've often talked about, but apply it in other ways to our lives. You know this, where it talks about if your right eye causes you to sin, what do? Pluck it out. Okay, and what about your hand? If your hand causes you to sin, what do? Right? Now, if you really think about that, like if you were there sitting as Jesus was telling you this for the first time, we kind of hear it, now we're kind of desensitized to it. That's extreme, right? Of like, ooh, I like my eye, right? I don't want to pluck it out. But what is it telling you? It's telling you that you have to hate that thing so much that you're willing to do without it, right? You're willing to do without your eye or your hand. And I have a lot of clients who, they know something to be wrong. They know that it's damaging them, but there's still a part of them that's not willing to give up with it. A good practical example of this is I had a client who's struggling with pornography, and this individual got rid of his phone, got rid of his laptop, because he said, I would rather do without the conveniences of life than to continue to struggle with this. Now, some people don't have to go to the extreme, but some people do. Some people really do. And you need to know what it is for you, that the steps that you need to take in order to overcome whatever addiction or struggle that you're having. So you have to hate the sin. You have to hate whatever you're trying to give up in order to fully overcome it. Why do we struggle with these behaviors? A part of it can be a lack of self-control. So let's look at this for a moment. This is a very popular quote that we talk about in Adventism. It says, the greatest want of the world is the want of men. Men and women who will not be bought or sold, men who in their inmost souls are true and honest, men who do not fear to call sin by its right name, men whose conscience is as true to duty as a needle to the pole, men who will stand for the right though the heavens may fall. Beautiful, right? And oftentimes we stop in reading that quote right there. But how do we have those men? What does the quote continue to say? If we continue to read, it gives us the how. She says here, but such a character is not the result of accident. It is not due to special favors or endowments of providence. A noble character is the result of self-discipline, of the subjection of the lower to the higher nature, the surrender of self for the service of love to God and man. And I love that because she's saying, it's not that some people were born, better off. Some people were born into families or situations. What she's saying is that these individuals cultivated self-discipline. And if you notice that you struggle with self-discipline, what I would encourage you to do is say, God, I recognize that, and leave here saying, I want to be committed to cultivating self-control and self-discipline. So why do we struggle? Lack of self-control, but also we struggle because we often utilize these behaviors to numb, to avoid, or to escape our problems. If you look at society today, why we're struggling a lot with addictions is this is a big reason. We're numbing or avoiding or trying to escape something. Maybe you lost a child and you realized that was really difficult and you started turning to, binge watching a show or whatever it may be. We're numbing our emotions. We don't know how to cope with them. So here's a list of the top 10 different addictions. There's alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, caffeine, medications. We often don't think about, a lot of people are addicted to medications, taking it in an unprescribed manner. Media is a very common addiction, and that can include TV, social media, video games, so forth. Sex in different ways. Some people say, I don't struggle with porn, but they struggle maybe with codependent relationships. They're actually addicted to codependent relationships. That person helps me cope with my emotions instead of me going to the Lord. Now, we can have healthy relationships where we support one another, which we'll talk about today, but also people can be addicted to unhealthy relationships. Food is a very common addiction. overeating, binge eating, or also to the other extreme of over-restrictive eating. People are deciding whether or not there might be a future diagnosis disorder of extreme healthy eating, where we're overly controlled in our healthy eating. Shopping can be an addiction. That the rates of shopping addictions went up during the pandemic. I had a client who said, "Oh, I noticed that when I'm feeling really emotional, what do?" She goes, "I add to cart." She goes online and she starts browsing and browsing and browsing. You can probably notice that for yourself. I remember one time I was, talking about this, and it was on my mind a lot, and I automatically reached for my phone during a conversation, and I realized I just turned to my phone to cope with my discomfort and my feelings that I was having. So we can naturally develop these as an avoidance, and including work. Work is a very common addiction. That we could also include in that category ministry. Many times we over-engage in ministry, not out of a place of wanting to help. We may want to help, but sometimes the primary need is actually because we want to avoid what's happening at home. We want to avoid what's happening in our day-to-day. So we can't be utilizing these things to avoid or to escape. I love this quote. It says, "A man that flees from his fear may find that he has only taken a shortcut to meet it." Excuse me. Can I get some water? Emotions don't kill you. The addictions you're using to numb do. I want you to think about that. Oftentimes we try to cope with those emotions because they feel so uncomfortable with addictions. But we have to realize the emotions themselves won't kill you. They feel really uncomfortable, even anxiety or panic, but they won't kill you. The addictions, the unhealthy ways we're coping can. All right. So prevention, intervention, we have to hate it. And we talked about lack of self-control, numbing. But also, we see here that we have to look at the deeper roots. What's at the deeper part of ourselves that are turning to these behaviors? Sean Smith says, what you lack in vertical awe, you will fill with horizontal addiction, right? Alluding to many of us, we may identify as Christians, but do we actually have a deeper connection with God? When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. This is from Dr. Viktor Frankl. This is very true. A lot of our young people, why they're struggling with media and phone addiction and so forth, is because they're really lacking a sense of purpose and meaning. So recognizing the deeper roots. And in our last presentation, the fourth part of our series, we'll be talking about those deeper roots. So step number 3. So if you remember, step number 2 is understanding what we need to surrender and why. Step number 2 is starting to decrease unhealthy behaviors. And then step number 3 is we're transitioning away from decreasing unhealthy behaviors to then increasing healthy behaviors. Fill your life with goodness. We'll focus on these points. Focus on what you gain rather than what you give up. Focus on the why and the who behind God's principles. So let's start with the first one. Fill your life with goodness. I love this parable. It talks about how there was a man, right, that the demon was cast out, and then he was empty, and what happened afterwards? 7 more came back. What does that parable mean? From a mental health perspective, what that means is oftentimes we get rid of the bad, but we never fill it, we never replace it with good. And from an addiction standpoint, what happens is the addiction will return and return worse. So this gives us an idea that I can't just say, stop doing this, stop doing this, stop doing this. I have to replace it with something good. I need to fill my life with goodness. We saw, when we talked about fleeing, in 2 Timothy 2, it says, flee also youthful lusts, but it doesn't say just flee. What comes afterwards? To pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace. We can't just get rid of the bad. We need to fill our life with good things. So as you're thinking about the things that you need to give up, I also want you to be thinking, what do I need to fill to replace that with? So I'm filling my life with goodness. And I love this proverb because it shows us what would be the consequence. A satisfied soul loathes the honeycomb, but to a hungry soul, every bitter thing is sweet, right? We have to be able to be satisfied and filled with good things. So what are these healthy behaviors that improve our mind and mood? What are some examples of healthy behaviors? Exercise, yes. Being in nature, yes. Well, what else? Helping others, yes. It's a little quiet. Fellowship, yes. So here are a couple. It's not an extensive list. Exercise, nutrition, connection, rest, music, water, hobbies, stress. Even stress is good for us. Deep breathing, nature, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go through these different ones in a little bit, looking at how they specifically impact our mind. A lot of times I think as Adventists, we know that these are good things, but we don't understand how good they are. And as we look at how good they are, it's more motivating for us to engage in these things. So we'll focus on what you gain versus what we give up. So let's focus on what we'll gain. One reason people resist change is because they focus on what they have to give up instead of what they have to gain, right? We need to shift our perspective to realize, what am I gaining? It's kind of like, oh yeah, I need to exercise more, right? What am I gaining out of exercise, right? Oh yeah, I have to go to bed earlier. What am I gaining? That can help motivate us in our pursuit. God does not require us to give up anything that is for our best interests to retain. In all that he does, he has the well-being of his own in view. We have to understand that, and we have to teach that to our young people. In all that he does, he has the well-being of his own in mind, in view. Would that all who have not chosen Christ might realize that he has something vastly better to offer them than they are seeking for themselves. We have to understand that. Man is doing the greatest injury and injustice to his own soul when he thinks and acts contrary to the will of God. No real and lasting joy can be found in the path forbidden by him who knows what is best and who plans for the good of his creatures. The path of transgression is the path of misery and destruction. God does not require for us to give up anything that is for our best interest, that knowing that he has something vastly better. I'm going to skip this for time, but focus on the why and who. So let's look at that. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy, not on fighting the old, but building the new. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. So you say, I want to become a healthier person. That's what I'm gaining. I want to be a good friend. That's what I'm gaining. So why has God given us these principles? Let's look at more of the specifics. He says, beloved, this is in 3 John, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers. God cares for us holistically, not just spiritually, but physically, mentally, socially, and so forth. So let's look at these behaviors a little bit more close up. So I won't be able to go into depth for each and every one of these, but I want to highlight a couple kind of just to tease you a little bit to go then for yourselves to research this more. So nutrition. How does nutrition impact the brain? You could do a search on YouTube. Chad Cruiser, which some of you may know, he's an Adventist, who talks a lot about the brain-gut connection. They call our gut the second brain. Why? You can see here, 90% of our neurotransmitters are actually in our gut. We think that all our brain chemicals are here. 90% are actually in our gut. So what we eat impacts how we feel. So Ellen White talks about this, of how eating spicy food can impact the temperament, can increase levels of anger and so forth. But what we eat impacts how we feel. So knowing that if you're struggling with depression, how's your diet? If you're struggling with anxiety, how's your diet, right? Knowing that God gave us these principles, not just for our physical health, that's important, but because it also impacts our mental health. Water, 70+% of our brain is water. The rates of anxiety and depression increase when we're dehydrated, right? Water is essential for our body and our brains to function properly. You can notice that when you're dehydrated, are you able to focus as clearly? Are you able to engage in a very stressful situation as well as you would being hydrated and focused, right? I see some people taking water right now. Water is good not just for our bodies, but for our brain. Water is essential for circulation, right? Something as small as, am I drinking enough water, can also impact our brain and our brain health. Music. Music is powerful. God gave us the gift of music. One thing to keep in mind, it's kind of like I'll give you some little snippet, kind of tidbits of information. Music, our heart syncs to the rate of music. So if you notice, if you put on heavy, heavy music with heavy, heavy beats, what happens to your blood pressure? It goes up. Your heart syncs to the rate of music. And so if you're struggling with anxiety especially, one small little thing you can change is to change your music. They recommend Baroque music. Why? Because the tempo of the music goes with the normal healthy heart rate that we should have. So some people might say, I have clients who especially are secular and so forth, and they say, let me have my music. And I said, no, that's your choice, completely your choice. This is not a Christian kind of principle. This is this idea that when you're struggling with something, right, you want to get better, you have to be willing to do everything you can, because what happens is layer upon layer is what contributes to change. So music, nature. There's so much research on nature, the smells of nature, the sights of nature. You notice why a lot of people are into essential oils and so forth these days. Why? Because you're taking little bits of nature, right, and you're putting it in your pocket. One thing you'll notice about these different principles, a lot of it is trying to go back to the Garden of Eden, right, where we had these things. And nature is crucial for our immune system, for our brain health. And so looking at the power of nature and being intentional. Do I have enough nature? Am I going out enough to commune with God, but especially taking in the sights and smells of nature? Have you heard of forest bathing? If you haven't heard of forest bathing, it's a fascinating studies that they've done where people go into the forest and are intentional about spending time, not actual bathing, but taking in the forest smells and sights. They call it forest bathing because of the effects of nature on our mind. Now, stress is important. Why do I put this up here? You say, oh, no, Katie, I have too much stress. You notice here in this curve is that too much stress is unhealthy for us, but also too little stress is also unhealthy. So if you're retired, I have a lot of clients who are retired. Why? Because they lack stress and meaning and purpose. And so finding ways in which you can engage in healthy stress. For young people, a lot of them are not doing well mentally because they don't have enough stress. Why stress is healthy is because we build our tolerance. We build our ability to handle different things in our lives. So checking the levels of your stress. If I have too much, bring it down. If I have too little, how do I engage in difficult things that can empower me to build my tolerance in the different stressors of life? Hobbies. Hobbies are really important. A lot of times we have this much stress and this much hobbies and pleasure. And what hobbies help us with is it provides a recharge, a cushion that allows us to then handle stress better. One thing that I notice with a lot of my clients is some of them have too much pleasure, too little stress, but oftentimes it's the opposite. And especially in ministry too, I believe that people are doing a lot of things that are productive and can be stressful, but they don't have enough rest, right? And it's important to have things that you enjoy, not just giving. They say you can't pour from an empty cup. And I have pastors as clients, I have ministry leaders, and one of the things I see the most is because they're giving so much and them at the expense of their own well-being. And hobbies are important as well. Sleep and rest. Sleep is extremely important for our mental health. I would say it's probably the top one or among the top three for our mental health. For those that struggle with bipolar disorder, sleep is one of the highest triggers for a manic episode. Sleep is extremely important for your mental well-being. And I put there rest too, because oftentimes I think as Adventists, we take the Sabbath for granted. In the mental health research, you're seeing more and more of people talking about the importance of rest, but of course, from a secular standpoint of, Sunday or choosing a day of your own, but having rest where you're intentionally resting and ceasing from work in order to recharge for the rest of the week. Ellen White says 2 hours of good sleep before 12 o'clock is worth more than 4 hours after 12 o'clock. She's talking about, it's not just about the quantity of sleep, she talks also about the quality. So it's important to go to sleep early to bed, early to rise, because of how melatonin works. Our melatonin starts producing more and more, getting us ready for sleep. And the longer that you push it off, you're fighting against your body, against your system, and prepping it to sleep. Now, for those of you, if any of you struggle with sleep, I have a handout specifically on sleep. We can't go through all these different details. And then also, before I forget, I'll have my email at the end of my presentation, both today and for the subsequent presentations. Some of you have asked for notes. So I'm more than welcome to send you my presentations as well. Okay, exercise. Now, we don't have to spend too much time with this, but exercise research shows that it's as helpful as antidepressants. Why people don't exercise as much as they take antidepressants? Because it requires work and discipline. So exercise is extremely important. Endorphins, which make us feel happy, right? Our happy hormones are endogenous morphine, meaning it actually is our own body's way of helping us reduce pain. But those painkillers also help with our emotional pain. That's why exercise helps us to feel better as well. Now, deep breathing. This is something that many people neglect to engage in. Deep breathing, slowly in through our noses and out through our mouths. Ellen White talks about deep breathing. She says that it soothes and tranquilizes the mind. She goes on to talk about other physical benefits of promoting digestion, promoting sleep, helps with appetite, it helps with blood circulation. What I find fascinating is when you look at a baby sleep, they naturally deep breathe. They use their belly to breathe. And over time, we lose this mostly because of poor posture. And we're not exercising as well, so we don't have the ability to stay upright. The more you exercise, the more you're going to naturally deep breathe, even when you're sitting or engaging in other activities. But you see that over time, with our bodies deteriorating, we're also engaging in less and less deep breathing. And so, something that we used to do naturally, we have to be intentional about doing it on a regular basis. So checking your posture is something so simple that you can look at, but also engaging in deep breathing. She also says that it imparts to the blood a bright color and sends it a life-giving current, right? And again, it soothes the nerves. For anxiety, it's one of the top skills that we teach people to help them regulate their anxiety. So that's one thing that's especially important. And then try, if you struggle with sleep, deep breathing right before you sleep. Singing. Singing is another thing. God tells us to rejoice always. Singing incorporates, this is one thing that mental health they don't talk about this, but I love to talk about it because it incorporates a lot of different elements. You naturally deep breathe while you sing. So you have deep breathing. You also have the content, right? If you're singing good, I like scripture songs because it really helps with the content. But then you have the music component, and then you see here many different benefits to singing, including reducing the stress hormone cortisol in our bodies. So there are many things that God tells us to do, not for him, for us, rejoicing always and singing praises to him as well. So some of you, may be familiar with these. New Start, right, has these principles from a physical health standpoint, but also from a mental health standpoint. At Beautiful Minds, where I work, we have the acronym Choose Life, and it has very similar principles of connection, hydration, optimism, oxygen, self-control, exercise, light, as in sunshine, vitamin D. We didn't talk about that today, but internal clock, food, and your environment. So these are things that are essential for our mental well-being. Now, what I find interesting is I think as time goes on, we're kind of losing sight of these principles, and the world is actually catching on, right? You think about veganism, right? You think about Sabbath keeping. The world is starting to realize these benefits, and they're choosing to do these things for their mental health or for their physical health, but they're lacking the key principle of God behind these principles. So the last step 4, is now we need to start setting goals. Now, this is important because if you just say, yeah, I would like to, but you never actually commit to goals, it's going to be really hard to start having improvement. So here are some steps. You can, go before the Lord and say, God, what are the negative things I need to give up? Then step 2, God, what are the positive things that I need to then replace with? And then ultimately ask God to give you the strength to follow through. Secular psychology, what often they do is they say, okay, now you do it. And that's really discouraging because can I do these things on my own? Have you ever tried over and over and over again? Going to God and saying, God, help me. I'm just trying to follow your will, so you need to help me with these things. Now, I don't have the time to go through all of these. I'm going to skip to this slide here. A great book on setting new habits is called Atomic Habits. So I just put that as a reference there. He emphasizes the power of small, tiny steps. I like to think about success is just small steps added up over time. He talks about the 1%. If you change, you'll see here, if you can get 1% better each day for 1 year, you'll end up 37 times better by the time you're done, right? Small little changes. Oftentimes, we're really hard on ourselves, do these big changes, and then we don't. Then we fall, and you go, why? Then we just give up altogether. Small steps added up over time. And so that's a great book for you to reference as you're making those changes. So looking at this, we see this principle also in Jesus' words, right? In Matthew, we see deny himself, take up his cross, but Luke adds a key word there, daily. When we do these things daily, a big, I think, hurdle for people making changes is that they have this long-term goal, then I messed up today. It's okay, get up and restart tomorrow, right? Daily take up your cross. It's not this perfection of, I took up my cross once and I'm good. God recognizes that we need to do this daily. So here are the steps. Know what and why you need to surrender. Eliminate and reduce some of those unhealthy behaviors, but then fill it with healthy behaviors and set goals. These are the 4 main steps that can help you in recognizing and making those changes and surrendering those behaviors to God. Now, we don't have time to go through this entirely, but if you want a good example of what this looks like, Elijah is a really good example. Elijah struggled with depression, and you saw that he kind of went through these steps of he had isolation, he had distrust of God's plans, he had fear, he had selfishness. But then we see that God came and introduced some New Start principles, right? That he was God told him to take a nap. He gave him food to eat. He had him drink water. He had him exercise. He had him have sunlight. He said, come out of the cave. What are you doing there? Communion with God. God gave these principles to him to help him get out of the depression. And we see here that then he was able to follow God's purpose and start living selfishly. And even though he had this temporary, kind of down moment, this valley of his life, what happens next in his story shortly after? He's translated to heaven. Isn't that beautiful? Right? That he wasn't perfect, but God helped him through his valleys and through his difficulties. Now, one last thing that I want to emphasize is one of the key things of behaviors that we need is, what do all successful weight loss programs have in common? Right? What do all successful addiction programs have in common? Connection. We can't do these things on our own. So a lot of us will start writing down notes of like, okay, I have this addiction. Okay, I'll work on it. But a part of, they say, secrecy breeds addiction. We actually need connection to be able to accomplish all of these steps. Connections are essential. Satan tempts us to be like, you're the only one struggling, or, you can't trust those people. You need to find people you can trust, but connection is essential. I'm going to skip this. Galatians 6:2 and Hebrews 10 emphasize this. And I like the verbiage here. He says, not neglecting to meet together. He's like assuming you're probably going to neglect. You're probably going to want to isolate, especially after the pandemic. But no, stir up one another to love and good works, right? For love and good behaviors, for good choices. How? By not neglecting to meet together, right? There's strength in numbers. Galatians 6:2 says, share each other's burdens, and in this fulfill the law of Christ. We need to come together. That's why weight loss programs and addiction programs have the element of connection. You need it. You see it in National Geographic when a lion is trying to get a gazelle, what happens? He isolates the gazelle from the herd, right? We need connection. And connection includes with God, right? Quoting promises, scripture songs, nature, prayer, Bible study, but also with others. There's a threefold: with others, with God, and God and others. Together, we need connection. And we see this, that in the process of coming and following Jesus, we see with Philip and Nathanael, that Nathanael came to Jesus through Philip. Come and see. We need to support one another in this process. So to close, I want to talk about the story of the healing of the paralytic man, to emphasize the importance of connection. I want you to take a look at these pictures, and I want you to think about, what do these pictures have in common? What's the theme here? Okay, so these are two pictures. I'm going to show you a couple more. What do they have in common? I heard Jesus healing. I heard friends. Actually, it's the opposite. If you notice, the friends are all cut out of the pictures. The reason why is oftentimes in this story, we focus on Jesus and the paralytic, okay? If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Mark chapter 2 with me. But the emphasis in the Bible is not Jesus and the paralytic. The emphasis is, as someone had mentioned, the friends. So the Bible in chapter 2 of Mark talks about how Jesus is there and in a room, and the room is packed, right? It says there's no longer room to receive them, not even at the door. And so then it says, verse 3, then they came to him bringing a paralytic who was carried by 4 men. And when they could not come near him because of the crowd, they went up to the roof. So here's some pictures of the friends. They went up to the roof, and what did they start doing? Started uncovering the roof. Is this easy or hard work? They could have just said, okay, it's full, sorry, maybe we'll come back later. But no, they started uncovering the roof. And as they uncovered the roof, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. And then verse 5 is very key. Listen closely. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, son, your sins are forgiven you. Whose faith? Their faith. The faith of the friends. So why was the paralytic healed? So we think, oh, Jesus, yes, Jesus, but specifically the friends. The friends' faith healed this paralytic man. So there's very valuable lessons for us. So let's look at the friends here. The friends were aware of his condition, right? They were aware that he was paralytic. The friends had friendship with the paralytic. They could have been like, oh, he's an outcast from society, but they were friends with him. The friends knew of Jesus and his healing power. The friends knew where they could find Jesus. Friends were willing to do the hard work, anything to get him to Jesus. So, you are that friend. Are you aware of the mental health needs of those around you? Do you have a friendship with those around you? Do you know that they struggle and therefore you know that you need to take them to Jesus? Do you know of Jesus' healing power? Do you know where to find Jesus? And then are you willing to do the hard work, anything to get your friends to Jesus? Specifically from a mental health perspective. Mental illness has a lot of stigma. So a lot of times we don't even want to be around those individuals, or we don't want to get too close or too intimate. But you are that friend. God can use you and your faith to heal your friends. Or are you the Pharisees? The Pharisees were there too. Both groups were present. Both saw the miracle. The Pharisees went away empty because of their pride and critical spirit. Many times we're critical. We're judging those in the church that have those struggles. They don't have enough faith. Well, they're like this for this reason. But the four men, because of their humility, recognizing their need, their surrender, and coming in faith, went away rejoicing with their friend who was healed. Now, the paralytic. The paralytic, he had close friends that knew about his mental health needs. He had Christian friends that knew where to find Jesus. He had quality friends that were willing to do anything for him. And he was willing to be taken to Jesus. Some of you are those friends, but some of you are the paralytic. Some of you here are needing that healing, that mental health healing from Jesus. So do you have close friends that know your mental health needs? A lot of times, it's not the friends are there, but we don't share. We don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to share our needs with others. Do you have Christian friends that know where to find Jesus? And are those friends aware of your struggles? Maybe it's easier to tell people in the world, but I don't want to tell my Christian friends. I need to have a smile and this face of perfection. Do you have quality friends, intimate relationships that are willing to do anything for you? If not, why not? A lot of times it's because we're afraid of intimacy. And then are you willing to be taken to Jesus? Which is easy to say yes, but it takes humility to be willing to be taken to Jesus by someone else. No, I want to come to Jesus on my own terms. I want to come in the secret chambers of my own room. Are we willing to be taken to Jesus? So some things to reflect on as we close. What are the unhealthy behaviors or addictions that you struggle with that are getting in the way of your own mental well-being and getting in the way of you following Jesus? Because these things do get in the way. Which healthy behaviors do you need to incorporate into your life? And then what is one step or one behavior you want to take today? Not tomorrow, not after camp meeting, today. Whether to help yourself personally or someone you know who is struggling. So tomorrow we're going to cover part 2 of Follow and looking specifically at thoughts and emotions. We'll pray, and I will leave up this slide for some resources and my emails at the bottom if you'd like any of the presentations. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you so much that you are a God that gives us choice to follow you. And in that process, giving us understanding of your will for us, that you don't restrict us from doing things. You actually want us to have life and life abundant. And so, Lord, I pray that anyone here that's struggling, that they may see a God of choice and of love and of goodness, and that goodness can lead to repentance, that can lead to them coming and denying themselves, taking up their cross and following you. And God, if there's someone here that's wanting to help a friend, Lord, may you place individuals in their path that they can be like these 4 men, that they can bring them to you. So Lord, help us in whatever needs that we have, and that as we leave here, that we can be encouraged by your healing power, knowing that that is available to us even today, even in this very moment. We love you and we thank you. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.